Welcome, everybody. It's the fourth session of the 2020 Government UX Summit. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We're going to be getting started shortly. While we wait, please tell us what agency or organization you're from in the chat. In the chat, you're going to find a link to the live captioning. You're also going to see links in there throughout the talk that will be helpful, including links to our community of practice and other helpful things. We've got a great program this year for the Government UX Summit, and I'm really excited to hear from our colleagues in government across the country, not just federal, but also municipal, like our next group of speakers. I want to give a big shout out of thanks to everyone who's made this event possible, including my co-chair, Jean Fox, who, if you've been to the first 3 sessions or you've been a part of our community of practice, you know the amount of work she puts into this community. She is amazing. I want to thank the staff at the GSA who have provided outstanding logistical support for this event. I want to thank everybody who submitted the amazing proposals and everybody who helped review the proposals to put together this fantastic program. All of our presenters who took time to share their experiences with us, the chairs who are facilitating each of the sessions, and all of you who have come to the session today. We've got a great program. We've still got 2 more sessions tomorrow, and it's not too late to sign up. Don't forget to register for each session separately. The summit has been organized by Digitalgov and the User Experience Community of Practice. The mission of Digital.gov, if you don't know, is to transform how government learns, builds, delivers, and measures digital services in the 21st century. They do that by providing people in the federal government with the tools, methods, practices, and policy guidance they need to deliver effective and accessible digital services. As a part of their mission, Digital.gov supports the User Experience Community of Practice, us. Our community provides resources to help those doing user experience work at all levels of the US government, and it's open to anyone with an interest in UX and has a government email address. Information on joining the group is available on our website or in the chat right now. Here's a couple of logistics before we get started. We're planning on having the videos of the presentations available online in a few weeks. We'll have as many of the slide decks available as we can as well. At the end of the event, you'll see a link to the survey in the chat. We really appreciate if you fill it out. It will help us have better events in the future. Please direct all of your questions to the chat. Our chair for this will be taking the questions and feeding them to our speakers to answer during the Q&A session at the end. And one last reminder, this event is being recorded. With that, I'd like to hand this over to Kristin Stetler, our chair for today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for participating today. I am going to add a couple links into the chat, which is the UX Community of Practice, which is open to all those with an email address from any level of government. And just to, as she said, we do have a couple great sessions tomorrow. So if you want to register for those, I'm also going to add a link to that. So today our speakers are Sarah Rigdon, Andrew Doe, and Kristin Taylor. They will be talking to you this afternoon about how service designers and content strategists can collaborate using some case studies from their work. Their presentation is called More, Better, Faster, How Service Design Helps the Austin.gov Team Transition Content at Scale. And just a reminder before we start that put your questions for them in the chat, and I will take them from there and ask them to the presenters in about 40 minutes or so. So great, let's go. Thanks.
All right, hello everyone. I'm going to first present. Let me share my screen. All right. We're looking good?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our talk, where we'll talk about the collaboration between service designers and content strategists and the lenses they bring to their work. As Kristin introduced us, we are a couple of service designers and a content strategist, and I'm very privileged to be sandwiched between Andrew Doe and Kristin Taylor, and we work together at the Office of Design and Delivery, which is a division of the Communications and Technology Management Department at the City of Austin, Texas. So I'll tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do as an organization. We work in a modified agency model. So teams and departments across the city are our clients, and we partner with them to help improve service to residents, which often includes digital services. And because we're a digital team, that's the lens we think about the most. We push for a centralized partnership with departments where we share team members, managers, and expertise across efforts. Our primary user is the resident, but in order to focus on the resident's needs, we must also focus very closely on a very secondary or a very close secondary user, the city staff. One quirk to or feature of local governments that might not be shared at the federal level is, as with many local governments, codes and rules and policies aren't the same across departments. The city provides such a wide array of services that teams who deliver those services are pretty diverse in culture. I went to a content strategy networking event last year in Austin where somebody asked me, what's the culture like at the City of Austin? And I said, you're going to have to narrow down your question because every department has its own culture, which is wonderful and also a challenge sometimes. And because we live in the city where we work, we get to see those services unfold before our eyes and get improved for ourselves and our neighbors. And with that, I will hand it over to Kristin.
Hi. So Sarah, you can just go on to the next slide, thanks. So last year, late last year, a couple members of our team put together this really great installation, and it depicts the city's PDF forms. So on Austin.gov, all of the PDF forms that exist there, and puts it in like this physical experience, right? So you can say, oh, this is what it must be like if the website was a real life book that I had to navigate through, or real life papers that I had to kind of shuffle through to find the right one. And on the City of Austin's website, there are 500 PDF forms among 6,500 plus PDFs. So that gives you kind of a general sense of what's happening on that website and what it looks like if you kind of dig into the cobwebs. So if you could switch sides. So we know that having that many PDFs and that many PDF forms is bad. It's bad for accessibility, it's bad for usability, all of these things. But also, as we look at forms, we realize that forms are quite often the front door to services that residents need. And if those forms are bad, if they're unfindable, unusable, then they become a barrier to accessing those essential services. So with that in mind, it's important for us on our team to create clear, accessible form as a key part, that's a key component of our digital transformation. But simply taking those forms line by line, word for word, and taking them from a PDF and putting them into a digital environment doesn't always solve the problem. There are other things that we need to consider as we transition those forms and make them interactive and responsive. And then we also, on top of those forms that are existing, those 500 forms that are existing on the website, we also have new services or services that don't exist that need an entry point, that don't have forms that are already existing in that virtual stack of PDF forms online. So our team has worked to transition both the existing forms and implement new forms for those new or restructured services. And more often than not, those forms in themselves need to be evaluated and improved because and I won't use a bad word here, but you can fill it in yourself, because transitioning a crummy PDF form into a digital environment leaves you with a crummy digital form. And so we're going to talk a little bit about two lenses that we use when we are transitioning or building these new forms. Thanks for, Sarah's driving, so thanks, Sarah. Great job on catching that cue. So as we approached our digital transformation, we have collaborated as content strategists. So you see in this little avatar on the left that we have represented, and service designers we see on the right that we've represented. And that we do that to be sure that whenever we create a new form or transition a form, we use the methods, tools, approaches of both disciplines to make those forms not crummy, to make them great. And so both service design and content design are focused on this user experience, but with different lenses. So I want to introduce you a little bit to those lenses now. So if you could switch our slide. Thanks. So a content strategist lens is really focuses on the on-page experience. They're looking at form mechanics, the usefulness of the form, the usability of the form itself, the findability of the form. We can think of this as like when a resident, what happens when a resident needs to use a form or needs to access a service, what they're going to see and what they're going to have to do. And then you can switch slides. Thanks. And then we have the service design lens, which views policies, procedures, systems, but we're looking at like a more of the holistic life cycle of that form. What happens after it's completed? And what are the rules and regulations that determine what can go into the form? And then what needs to happen after the form is submitted? And so if we switch slides again, as we bring those two lenses together, we can make the form not only usable and useful for the resident, but usable and useful for the service providers and program managers, so that they can not only provide a better service, but they can successfully deliver on the policies and the procedures and manage the service itself with that form. And so we realized that without considering both aspects at some level, we wouldn't be able to create a good experience for our users, both the service providers and the residents. So next slide. And so as we've worked and done this transition or transformation, we have two case studies we're going to share, and we're going to talk about the main difference in those is that if you see on the left, we have a service designer and a content strategist in this blob together, right? The blob being the project. They're working hand in hand, side by side from beginning to end, really engaging their perspective, their tools and their lenses to execute a project or execute a form. And then we have other cases like the one on the right where it really is the content strategist driving the work, but she either has the access to a service designer or has worked with a service designer enough to bring in their lens. And so that's kind of like a tool in his or her back pocket that they can use to make the form better. So with that being said, we're going to talk about a couple of case studies, and I'll hand that to Sarah.
Thanks, Kristin. So the first case study we're going to talk about is one that I've been privileged to work on and still work on, which is the creation of the form, a complaint form against the Austin Police Department or officers for the Office of Police Oversight. For this project, the service designer definitely led. There was a collaboration, of course, and I'll get into that point toward the end of our case study, but primarily this is a case study where service design absolutely led and needed to, and let me share why. So to set the scene, this is a very high profile and complex project that I will not go into because we're here focusing on service design and content strategy and the creation of forms as a way to talk about that collaboration. But if you're curious, I can send you tons of press. There's a lot of local media about this case. and I will not be able to do justice to it. But I can attempt to squish the background into just a little bit of time. So to set the scene, at the end of 2017, there was a contract called a Meet and Confer that was a contract between the Austin Police Association, which is the police union here in Austin, and an organization called the Office of Police Monitor. And it lapsed. And so essentially, while the Office of Police Monitor existed, they were not dissolved, everybody in the organization still had jobs. They were just not legally allowed to do police oversight activities because there was no contract in place. So City Council with Austin addressed this and said, okay, in March of 2018, they passed a resolution directing the city manager to conduct research and report back to council with recommendations for improving the effectiveness, transparency, and efficiency of the police oversight system. So to that end, the city manager then created the Police Oversight Advisory Working Group made up of local community groups that have been working in criminal justice in Austin for decades, including the Austin Justice Coalition, which is still doing excellent work today, and convening experts across the city of Austin stakeholders and the community of experts who work in police oversight nationwide, and asked them to draft a proposal for consideration by the city manager and the city council to improve the system. So we had a mandate, and that's where we came in. Many people worked on this project. The service designers and user researchers on the Office of Design and Delivery team were Chris Lutke, Pooja Balachandar, Ashley Harris, and an organization called the Austin Tech Alliance, and many other organizations worked together to do research and service design. And so in the UX profession, we know a classic how might we question, which is where we started with this project. How might we help the Office of the Police Monitor make the complaint process more accessible and responsive to public needs? With that in mind, we had a couple of goals, small ones. First of all, to understand the entire complaint process from intake, processing, and follow-up, including all of the pain points, opportunities, and gaps in these processes. And once we had that, identify opportunities to address pain points and gaps and test ideas, really prototype, to help the Office of Police Monitor deliver a more accessible and responsive service. So of course, we want to put users at the center, where we really do deep research with people with lived experiences, and that can include edge cases, which we always want to include. As we dug into that work, these are some of the quotes of the real people with lived experiences of filing complaints against the Austin Police Department. And you can see this speaks to what we already knew and what the city auditor's office in their study that was going on concurrently and independently from this service design and user research project. We weren't surprised, but the depth of alienation and just confusion about an inherently confusing process and a confusing service really came to the forefront in all of these interviews. So interview activities consisted of classic user research interviews where we talked to people with lived experience and people who knew this deeply, who had been in the fight for change locally as community organizations for a long time. There's Chris right there giving an interview or interviewing somebody from the Austin Justice Coalition. Shadowing activities could not happen exactly the way we usually do them because at this time there was no meet and confer contract in place. So we couldn't shadow somebody going through the complaint process because there was no complaint process at the time. But we did identify lots of folks who were willing to talk to us about their recent experience filing a complaint with the Austin Police Department or against an Austin police officer. That included, as a part of this ongoing research project, community engagement. Part of the service design went beyond the usual user research because this service was all encompassing and really took the entire city into consideration. So we did a ton of deep interview and group activities to try and get some synthesis and see themes across the city. And this was successful largely due to the work of the Office of Police Monitor. Their staff has been deeply developing outreach to community organizations who understand the challenges of the environment they're in and have been working to improve them for a long time, including the director at the time, Farah Muscadin, who is still the director, and she's in that gorgeous red top right there. And of course, once you do all the research, it's time to do synthesis. And we have here a few of the teammates who made this happen at the Office of Design and Delivery and the Office of Police Monitor. So we want to see patterns and opportunities, and to make a very large project a little more succinct and get to our service design and content strategy collaboration. We did indeed create that service blueprint that is the gold and the gold star that a service designer is trying to get to, the end-to-end line of interaction, including both the end user, the front stage, and the frontline staff, the administrators of the service in the back end or back of house. So as you can see, this is quite complex. So you might not be surprised to learn that there were many recommendations that the service design and user research team handed to the Office of Police Oversight. This included changing the name of the office, which did get accepted. They are now the Office of Police Oversight. And another recommendation was sending a feedback survey with every police interaction, which has not yet been accepted, but we are working on it. One of those recommendations was to make it as easy as possible for residents to file a complaint, which means you should be able to do it from your phone. It also required simplifying the complaint process as much as possible. That service journey map pointed to an extremely complex complaint process. At the time, you had to sign an affidavit in person, which that requires a couple of different visits to offices in person, which if you're part of a marginalized or vulnerable group of people in Austin, you're not gonna do that. It's extremely intimidating to be in person and do that. And so what this created for the first time in Austin was the ability to file a complaint about a police officer anonymously, which you can do today. So unfortunately, the collaboration between the service designer and the content strategist on this project did not happen the way we wanted it to. The timing just did not work out in time for council and the police union and all of these required stakeholder groups to come to an agreement on the meet and confer, the new contract, so that the Office of Police Oversight could carry out their services to the community. That didn't happen until December of 2018, at which point my team and I at the Office of Design and Delivery got straight to work and made it happen as quickly as possible. But that meant there was a gap between the final presentation and research synthesis that the service designers and user researchers did of a few months between the time that they ended and I was able to come in as a content strategist and embed in, well, not embed, to really dive deep into the research. It's a testament to how well they documented all of their work that I was able to make sense of it, and they were still on staff. So I could come and talk to them about any of the details that I wasn't understanding based on their extensive documentation of the work. Ideally, as a content strategist, I would have loved to have been embedded, but I didn't join the team until November of 2018. So those were kind of the complications. If we had control over everything and we had it to do again, for something as complex as this, the lesson there is you really do want your content strategist embedded in the user research and service design team as much as possible. Because it's complex and you need to be able to understand each of the recommendations and all of the evidence behind it in order to turn that into real life and on-page experience, and to make a ton of calls and a ton of decisions about how best to route the user through a form, which seems quite simple, but is actually quite complex. So today, the Office of Design and Delivery's web team has put together a completely new website for the Office of Police Oversight. This is their department page, just above the scroll. There's more information below, and you can go to alpha.austin.gov to find this and more. And it is an alpha, so it's not the complete city website, but we're working on that. So yeah, top services. You can file a complaint about an Austin police officer online from your phone anonymously for the first time in Austin history. You can also thank an Austin police officer. That feedback loop didn't exist before. So we made it very easy to recognize excellent service that you experience from a police officer or that you witness experience from a police officer. And right away, people started using both. So we see really good examples of both. And just anecdotally, I think that, you might think, well, the complaint form would be used a lot more than the thank you form. The numbers, I don't have off the top of my head, but people use the thank you form a lot. And you can also see official complaint and discipline documents. Those were shared before, but one thing that hadn't been shared yet was the Office of Police Oversight's initial recommendations for what internal affairs within APD should investigate. And so this opened up the floodgates for the community to be able to share their feedback. So this is a bit of a preview about what that looks like when you get to that page. So you click file a complaint about an Austin police officer, and then you can do that in several ways, whatever you're most comfortable with. And you can remain anonymous. You do not need to share your information. And we tried to make it as simple as possible so that there's few screens as possible to go through it. And you can attach evidence if you have it, if you want to. You can talk about the police officers or witnesses. Each of these, every single part of the form was informed by the service design work and the recommendations and the evidence that they came up from, and deeply informed by a ton of interviews that were done. We also, the digital team, had the luxury of creating the form from scratch. So this is a bespoke form that we built based off of open source government libraries. So that makes it all possible. But not every team is going to have access to a team of designers and developers. And even if you do, it's not always practical to build a form from scratch. The City of Austin also has a contract with FormStack, which we're being tool agnostic here. You can use whatever tool you want. But that's the reality of what a lot of governments are going to be using, whether or not you have access to a design team. But no matter what tool you use, you should be able to really change every single aspect of the form to fit the findings of a service designer. Yeah, so that leads me to our next case study, which Andrew will talk about, focusing on municipal court.
Unmute. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm a service designer here on the team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of this ongoing project that we have working with our municipal court. If you could just go to the next slide. So this is, as my colleague Kristin alluded to, is like what happens when in this case, we actually led with a content strategy lens, and I was sort of brought in, so if we go to the next slide, to really help support that work. Hence kind of like that, sort of like that white space and squiggly line. That is not me. I do not have a mustache, in case you couldn't tell, but as supporting, and our colleague Jo unfortunately could not join us, but she was the content strategist working on this. Where we were tasked with, at the time, where the municipal court if we can go to the next slide, they, as one can imagine, the kind of popular image of a courthouse having a lot of processes and a lot of forms, and a lot of this is true in this case. And at the time, the municipal court, so if you can go to the next slide, was looking to really get online with virtual dockets, especially now when access to government services, a lot of it is going to have to be intermediated online. So you can imagine how sentencing and hearing a court case can look like over Zoom. But just to kind of give a sense of the volume at which they process, and they're a pretty small team, but they take over 300,000 inbound phone calls and emails. And as content strategists, one other thing I know content strategists try to do as a metric for success is try to reduce that level of, I like to call it failure demand, where it's like, if something isn't obvious, you need to actually go to someone to talk. You need someone in kind of like that frontline staff customer support role to help kind of answer questions when that service isn't immediately clear. And as one can imagine, with a lot of forms or documents that are associated with a lot of legal proceedings, they aren't always necessarily the most clear things, but also just the volume of court cases that the municipal court processes. So City of Austin is a city about maybe just under 1 million people. They process over 215,000 court cases in the last fiscal year alone. And one of the processes that they wanted us to really look and transition online was their alternative payments process. So it's an alternative sentencing mechanism. So about 47,000 of those cases involved setting up a payment plan or an alternative or an extension of when you can pay a fine off, for example. And about 11,500 of those cases involved a fee reduction or a fee waiver. And in some of those cases, about 2,900 of those cases, a lot of the times the defendants were declared indigent, which in this means they didn't necessarily have the money to necessarily pay down their fine, and there's a whole host of forms in which to do that. So last year alone, the municipal court waived about $1.45 million in fee waivers. Some of this work comes out of kind of the an audit office report that kind of looked like, was municipal court being used to fund city services? In the case of Austin, that wasn't necessarily true, but remember, this is around 2016, right after Ferguson, when that was a big conversation about civil forfeitures. So that is where a lot of this, the context for this work emerges from. So we can go to the next slide. So just to kind of give you a sense of like the intense kind of processes that the courthouses have, one of the benefits, and I think as a service designer that we were able to notice, is that a lot of departments already have these processes in place. And a good starting point is to always ask them about, like, show us like what your quote unquote official process is. I know it's a little small to see, but I sort of circled in red where you can see where there is a payments process. So if you have to pay down a fine, and in the case of the City of Austin, you can either get a traffic ticket, you can commit in the state of Texas a Class C misdemeanor, or a violation of a city ordinance, and you either have the option to plead no contest, which is admitting that you have indeed done the thing that you are being ticketed for, or if you decide to go to trial, it can end up with an outcome where you may end up having to pay a fine anyways. So if we go to the next slide, so then once it's decided that we actually pay a fine, then there are all these kind of steps that are kind of involved. And I'm going to walk you through some of these forms. So there is, you can either pay in full, and that's over. I was talking a little bit about payment plans and extension to pays. That's where this happens. This kind of triangle here, unable to pay, that is where there's financial indigency, and there's a form associated with that. But then there's also alternative ways in which you can do that as well. There's a request for a jail credit, and then there's also the ability to do community service in lieu of that, which I won't get too much into details, but just to kind of give you a sense of which many directions that this can fork in. This was clearly a very complex service, and our scope of work was really just to focus on how do we actually just optimize that form. So this is something that our content strategist, Joe, noticed, right? And was just kind of like, I wonder if there's an opportunity to actually rethink this entire process. Because like, even from a staff perspective, this is very, like the amount of steps that are involved seem quite overwhelming. I remember walking into municipal courtrooms and there was an entire hallway where they actually just taped up this process chart, and it took up the entire hallway. So you can imagine how confusing it can be for a resident. So we go to the next slide. So we're just going to go run through this quickly. So this is the form of what it looks like to actually fill out your financial information to determine if you're indigent. This used to be 9 pages long. They have since broke it down to 3 pages. And, my colleague Kristin made a point where it's like, what's the point? Like, yeah, sure, we can digitize this form and make it in HTML and make it accessible. But if ultimately the form is just unusable, digitizing that form isn't going to necessarily make this a better experience. So that's just an example of some of the forms, and some of the feedback we got even from staff was really interesting. So that's just what that form looks like. So if we go to the next set of forms, this is what your jail credit form looks like, which is something defendants can use if the timing of it is a little complicated, but if you get charged with another crime where you're supposed to do jail time and you happen to be in jail, you can use that time, and it's like set at a rate at which you, like, they basically use the opportunity cost of when you were in jail to pay down the fine. Does that make sense to people? So like, if you were in jail, that's like set at a rate, and I don't have the exact numbers at the top of my head, but I believe it's like something in the realm of 200 USD a day. And if your fine is like 500, then it'll take 2.5 days of jail to pay off that fine. So that's kind of, I'm really speaking at a high level, and so that's kind of the rough idea of how that works. If we go to the next set of slides, and then this is the community timesheets. So if you are a defendant and you get matched with a community service, you'll notice on the form, it's kind of hard to see, but the same form, it's in English and it's in Spanish as well, but it asks the same set of questions, which a lot of people found pretty confusing. But essentially you have to fill out a timesheet if you've been sentenced to do community service. And then the last set of forms is actually the application form if you are a nonprofit or a community service provider who wants to actually take on volunteers. There is a whole other process involved as well. So, just kind of glancing at these forms looking like, and our colleague Joe, who obviously cannot join us today. So kind of the next slide. What did we do? I really wish Joe was here, because then she can speak a lot more to her thinking. And if we go to the next slide, this is kind of like the steps in which we took. So I was very much involved in step 1, which is when we actually talked with our municipal court colleagues and try to get them to think about how can we actually rethink and reimagine what these forms are meant to do. And then Joe took I was charged with one of the value adds that I thought I could create for our content strategist was like, okay, our content strategists needs insights to be able to reimagine and transform what these forms can look like and to digitize them. So we worked out a plan to be like, my role is going to help you create a lot of these design artifacts and which I will show you, these design artifacts that hopefully can help you take the insights from those artifacts, which you can then use to actually create a new form, which is something Joe did. And they're now in the middle of usability testing it. So we are showing you a project that's still very much in progress. So we go to the next set of slides. So the very first thing I was talking about are a bunch of workshops. So we actually had to go to municipal court and talk with a lot of the frontline staff who actually had to field calls and are in kind of like, it's on the first floor. There's a lobby area where many of them are actually fielding questions from people who are looking to resolve a court case. And it's a very old building, and we were only able to find like a very small training room. It was quite a suffocating room with no air ventilation or whatever, but this was the room that we had to work with, and trying to work with that physical environment when we can all still congregate in person, remember what those days were like. And so if we go to the next slide, I will just kind of give you a flavor of some of those design artifacts that we had, where one of the things that, in being in the service design community, and I'm glad that we are being exposed to this government UX community, is that even in the realm of local government, is that there are a couple of cities that are actually practitioners of user experience and service design. And one of the things we learned is like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we actually took some workshops that the city of Orlando actually did, where this was, the city of Austin is not the only city trying to think about how to digitize and transition content from analog content to an online experience. Other cities are doing that too. So one of the things we learned is just by kind of reaching out to our community is actually learning the city of Orlando was that this was an issue that they were encountering, and this was like a problem they were being asked to solve, is how do we digitize forms? So reaching out to them and really playing around with some of the workshops we had and modified it to our purpose, for our purposes. So we created like a paper prototype form game. So what I'm going to do is actually kind of show you, we've since obviously now had to digitize it. So I'm kind of going to show you a mural board of of some of the exercises we've done, where we actually work with city staff to actually get them to think about content strategy and think about this form and but also not just the form itself, but how the form functions as a touch point as a broader experience, but not just from a resident facing perspective, but also just like how do they experience that form as well. So we'll show you this mural board, and this is the one that we showed our municipal court friends with, where kind of just talking a little bit about the goals at the high level, where for me the goal was to ultimately end up with artifacts and leave behinds and take home things that our content strategist Joe can then take to actually work with and turn that into an online form. And one of the very first things we do is just to get their feet wet, is actually just get them to think about like what the use case here, and what's the resident user story in using this form, but then also you who has to actually take this form, what's your user story here? What are you trying to do? And get them to like think and reframe it around that perspective. And one of the insights, having done these workshops about 3 times now, is a lot of the times the city staff actually hearing their user stories was really interesting, because they talked a lot about like, oh, we just want to make sure that the information is correct. But then as we probe them and talk to them a lot more, learning that actually the point of these forms and a lot of the point of the processes. So I showed you all these complicated processes before, and that workflow. And one of the key learnings that we had, and it was kind of an aha moment that we all had, is that a lot of those processes and a lot of the information on these forms can almost end up being overruled just based on what the judge decides. Ultimately, the judge decides everything, and whatever the staff recommendation is, the judge can literally sign a sentence on a napkin, on a piece of napkin paper, and that can be what the final decision is. And so flipping it on its head and realizing it's like, okay, now that we actually understand this about what the form is and what your goal is, you're really just trying to make sure that this form has the right information that you can ultimately deliver to the judges, so that the judges can render, whatever the right and hopefully just decision is going to be. So getting them to think about that has been very helpful. Just getting to think of like, what problem is this form trying to solve, not just for residents, but for you. So now I'm just going to kind of move on over. And one of the things we try to do, not necessarily having a full-scale service blueprint, but getting them just through to that exercise of tell us how this form moves between you and your colleagues. Just help us understand that, because that helps us kind of understand like, what's this form trying to solve for that organization? Because forms aren't just there for residents to access services, but presumably staff need information that are on these forms to be able to do their part of completing that service. So, just walking through some steps to just make them think about like, well, where does that form go? Who sees this data? Where does this get stored? Like just those kind of like very in the weed mechanics. So as I was mentioning, one of the things that ultimately what we're trying to do is get these forms to live on the new Austin.gov website was, and in each of the content modules on the Austin.gov website, we actually get people to describe, and this is something that we do that's unique to us that, the city of Orlando doesn't necessarily do, just being inspired very much by them, is actually getting them to think about like, okay, if we were to like describe this service to like a resident and having staff do that, how would you actually describe that service to residents? So, using Sarah's previous example of the OPO form, because it is a service that is, very clearly described, and from our usability test, residents understand what the point of it is. How do we get staff to actually describe what alternative payments are and what a financial affidavit is? So getting them through kind of like an exercise where you had me and Joe in the room actually just coaching them through describe this service in a really easy way. And this is very much like the tangible product that ultimately we're trying to make live online, that we can then show to municipal court to kind of build that ongoing buy-in and making sure that there's something that we can actually show to our partners. And we have them review the content of the existing form as well, where, you know, we have a checklist, like a content strategy checklist of like, let's actually rewrite this form to make it as readable and understandable as possible. Are all the fields in this form actually required? I remember one conversation that was kind of happening when they were just saying, is like, well, you know, when we kind of asked them the question, is like, is this field required? And one of the staff was just kind of saying, is like, wow, we ask our residents to fill out like this field on like what is their stock portfolio, what is their pension plan. And many of the residents who end up using this, as we know, are unfortunately not residents who necessarily have that, but there is this expectation that it feels mandatory. So even just get them clearing, there's like, by the way, this is, you know, just even having helper text saying that this is, you know, not mandatory makes a huge difference.
Hi, Andrew. We have about 2 minutes and then we need you to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. And then the last thing we had is just kind of, is this form building activity where we get, you know, there's components of a form, like there's an eligibility component to a form. What are the questions there? And then there is a disqualifier component to the form. What happens if you aren't eligible? So just getting them to think about that. So this is very, very much so service design really being used to develop design artifacts for content strategists. So we'll go back to the slides. Ultimately, this is what Joe ended up creating, which is kind of using FormStack, which was our vendor to make kind of an online form with some conditional logic to make that eligibility and that disqualification somewhat easier to navigate. Some of the parting kind of shots that I'll kind of leave here, one of the lessons we learned is really understanding the problem that form is trying to address, which is making sure that information can be delivered to judges so they can render an appropriate judgment. And some of the other things, so this is a project that Joe is still working on, but the fact that we have tangible deliverables is something that actually helps us develop and keep that long-term relationship with municipal court leadership and staff, which actually segues into kind of the last thing. But content strategy, because there are tangible products that we can create at the end of it, it actually is a great entry point to help internal clients to think about that forms as a touch point and think about the broader end-to-end experience. And this is where someone like myself can then come in to actually help them think about, like, how do we actually redesign that entire journey and that entire workflow? But we need to actually prove our value first. And the way we've been doing that is through Joe. So I'll leave it there. So in terms of discussion, I don't know if you've noticed, but Sarah Rigdon is a content strategist presenting about something that is service design led, and I'm a service designer presenting about something that it's content strategy led, which kind of speaks up to like how the collaboration actually works, is that this is where we actually where in practice, we actually end up learning a lot about how we all work, but also being able to be good expert generalists, where I'm able to do a little bit of content strategy and Sarah Rigdon is able to do some service design just by actually just collaborating together. We're able to learn some of those skills together. So we're going to just leave you all with some discussion questions.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear, some questions, but also just sharing some of the experiences that you have if, collaborating, the service designers, UX researchers, and content strategists.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you guys so much. There was so much great information there. And if you have a chance to look at the comments in the Zoom group chat, you'll really see how much the audience appreciated all of the different parts and overall. So, that was fabulous. So I wanted to go back and ask, we had a couple questions about the PDF, exhibit. And so Rachel Valentine asked, did you use the physical exhibit of the PDFs to inform the residents or your colleagues? What was the goal of the exhibit? It looks awesome. So I was hoping someone could answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to jump in, but I went to the exhibit and helped set it up. And let me see if I can go back to that. So there, we actually have, and I can post this in a chat, we have a Civic Queso post on our blog about this. Civic Queso, which is, queso is one of the favorite foods of Austin. So Sarah Rodriguez is the expert generalist. I will call her that as well. She's a data storyteller and a data analyst and a researcher who put together the idea of this exhibit. So first, of course, there was an inventory. You have to do an inventory of the entire website and basically crawl the website for all of the forms. And she did this in collaboration with other folks on the team. And so for, there was this excuse, the city has a digital inclusion week. And so she thought it would be a great idea to make it a physical exhibit because it didn't start out that way. The project was really just let's understand what all PDFs are on the website. Like, how voluminous is it? What's the goal of digitizing the website? What's really ahead of us in the landscape? And then that meant printing it all out and being able to categorize it by type, which led to, out of 6,500 or so forms, 500 or PDFs rather, 500 of those were forms. And I'll link to that blog post in the chat so you can learn more.
Great. Yeah, there's some good stuff in the chat about that because, yeah, there's definitely a lot of interest in that. So thank you so much for that. So I wanted to go to the case study that Sarah covered, and there was a question from Wendy about how have the officers responded to the outcome. While I'm at it, there was also a question about what was the open source Gov platform regarding forms design that you mentioned.
Oh my goodness, I'm gonna blank on the name of it. I can also share the link after the presentation with everyone to the repo that we used. I think it's the US. I think it's the US form system. We used that library and started from there, and then modified it as we needed. Yeah, that is what it is. So that's what we used to get started with developing the form in a bespoke way. But in terms of how the officers reacted to the forms, kind of general as a question, I would say they didn't know the purpose of they didn't see the benefit of the forms until it started rolling out. There was a lot of resistance to doing it this way from the police union. And I think simply because that's the way it had always been done, just like resistance to change in general, and the perception that that's going to make things worse for officers. But actually, transparency really helps police officers. I can't think of an example off the top of my head in Austin, but in Houston, which is another city I've lived in, when the body cam debate first started and they were implementing body cams in the Houston Police Department, there was an instance of a cop that was like, actually, this is great. Like, having body cam footage is great because sometimes a resident will accuse us of things that didn't happen. And because we have the footage to show, actually, this is what you did, it helps everybody in that engagement. So I don't know if that answers your question more to the complaint form or the thank you form, or just in general, these changes.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So Andrew, on case study 2, Rebecca Otto wanted to know how you do usability testing with applicants and with city staff for the form output.
So I wish I could answer that question, and I can connect you to with our colleague Joe, because that's actually happening now. And one of the reasons that that graphic of me and the content strategist is written that way, and it's something that we're having lessons on in retrospectives, is like, should I only have been involved in that kind of that first part of creating design artifacts, or should we have staffed the project in such a way that I could have been involved more? So I'll be very honest that I have not been as involved in those usability testing conversations. One of that being said, and I'm going to try to answer your question in another way and kind of saying one of the things you'll notice in our case study is we were talking to city staff and we didn't actually interact with users. And that is kind of another big difference between that second case study where, you know, the content strategy was like, okay, we're going to create this new website forms where you're interacting with municipal court. And it was something that me as a service designer can advocate for and have, whereas, and to be fair, Joe did as well, but was also just kind of like, to really redesign these forms, we should like actually not, you know, city staff input is incredibly valuable, but we will also need help with development. And initially we weren't scoped to do that and we didn't have that buy-in to do it. But that being said, and I think one of the things as service designers and UX professionals is we can sometimes kind of have really creative workarounds around that. So the way that at least I try to do it just to really get a lay of the land and just kind of seeing how's the current experience now is actually just shadowing, like actually going to that courthouse, sitting there in the afternoon, just trying to see what's going on while, you know, not necessarily overhearing conversations, but also being able to go to a walk-in docket. I don't know if that answers your question, but, you know.
Okay, that's helpful. There were a couple questions about the Miro. So for the Miro mural board, Nicole Bennett asked, you know, that you presented, how did you use them for the workshop from a logistical standpoint? Did you have your workshop attendees complete the steps online?
Oh, that's a great question. So initially we did actually all our workshops on physically. So we actually completed all our workshops for municipal court. We were able to do it physically. We haven't needed to do it digitally yet. We are, however, trying this out with another department, with our Austin Public Health folks for some forms that they want to transition online. So it's a question I will get back to you as soon as we did it, because we just created like what I have just did. And sorry if I didn't make the expectations clear, is I just digitized kind of like what we offered physically, that analog experience. But now that we can't actually physically be in person, I figured, you know, let's actually try to think about how to digitize this virtually. I'm also happy to share the link. Like one of the great things about this community is that like we don't need to reinvent things from scratch. We can just build on top of assets that we've all created for each other and kind of customize it for our own need. So I'm happy to share, and also happy to share lessons like as soon as we actually try that out with our first department in Austin Public Health.
Okay, and so related to that is Chizabam Nwagi asked, how did you come up with the workshop layouts for Miro, and do you have any resources for Miro workshopping for stakeholders or users?
The way I remember looking at like a few workshop links. So one of the things that I have found useful about Miro is that they're very active in sharing like examples and things that are inspirational and just taking some of that and then kind of coming with our own. There are some versions where like all the activities are in one giant artboard, and I just sort of made the decision to split up the artboards. So it's kind of a combination of like, I don't even remember like the exact links, but looking at what Miro has done, but I'm happy to share this link as well, and feel free to like fork it and build on top of it. So.
Okay, and there's some great links now in the chat, so people should take a look at that. And then another question from Paul Colley was, out of curiosity, any thoughts on how you estimate LOE for this kind of work? I think one of the fundamental things is being able to communicate at a project plan level this work with stakeholders. Would love to hear any tidbits on how you guys manage the time and other people's time getting the work done.
I can speak first, and then Sarah, I don't know if you want to jump in terms of the level of effort. So one of the things that's at ODD, and I think it's a reality that a lot of us public servants and UX professionals face in government is that our team is very, very small. So it's kind of the reality is that Joe, our content strategist, had to play that project manager / product manager role. And as I think you all know, and just to be very candid with all you, it's very hard to do project management and then content strategy and design at the same time. They are two very different mindsets. So there is a lot of context switching. And I just wanted to be transparent and very frank about that. And I think had we been able to do it again, having someone to play that, to at least play that Scrum Master role would have definitely made us a lot more efficient. Sarah, I don't know if you want to speak more to this.
Yes. So in general, yeah, so not only are we a small team, we're also working in a bottom-up culture change approach at the city. It's the best when you have executive leadership buy-in. We don't always have that. What we do is build relationships across departments. So we had a deep relationship with the director of police oversight already, and they had already had the authority and deep work of community engagement. So starting from the top down made it very easy. We don't always have that. You know, with municipal court, that took a few months of relationship building before the reforms workshop began. And that consisted of, we work in an agile way. There's different flavors of agile, but part of our system is every 2 weeks we do a sprint review, and we invite everybody to the sprint review, everybody across the city, but especially the people, the stakeholders whose services we're working on that sprint. So we invited MuniCourt folks to the sprint reviews for weeks, for, well, many sprints leading up. And so that's part of that relationship building, is they were able to see it in advance of engaging with it.
I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Our speakers, Kristin, Andrew, and Sarah. Our chair, Kristin, my co-chair for the event, Jean, our hosts at GSA, and all of our lovely participants. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Please join the community of practice if you haven't already. And I hope to see some of you online tomorrow for tomorrow's 2 sessions, which are dealing with managing UX. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Great job. Thanks so much.